flagship university for the state of Hawaii. We are so proud that you are here and part of this process. Representative Perruso and I have been, over the last 6 months, really digging down into understanding and bringing the public along with us to understand how the state budget is made. So this is our first fully in-person event. We've done many events with various people like former Governor David Ige, former Budget and Finance Director Calbert Young. We've had advocates from Hawaii Appleseed with us, and we've had members of the public joining us through Zoom and in person as well when we did our very first charrette to gather priorities from the public at Mililani High School. So we really wanted to start off this year, 2025, continuing to bring the public along with us in understanding the budget process. And we are so fortunate on this very first, very full week of January 2025 to be introducing our first guest and our only guest here, but we hope that there will be many more conversations where we engage experts in government to help the public understand how the budget is made. Our guest is someone who has had a long history in public service. We were just speaking before we started that his very first job, straight out of college in 1993, was as a budget analyst for the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Can you believe that? 1993. Fast forward, in 2011, he joined Governor Neil Abercrombie's administration as the Deputy Director of Budget and Finance. That was followed in 2014, where he became and served as Director of DBED under Governor David Ige. And now, after a hiatus of one term with Governor Ige, in 2022, he was asked and called upon by our current governor, Josh Green, to serve as the Budget and Finance Director. Louis is someone who can break down the budget. He is here to give us an overview of the governor's priorities. We are starting a full week at the legislature now with budget briefings in both the finance committees and the Ways and Means committees. Louis was on the hot seat in front of the finance committee yesterday, so he's here to give us, again, that brief overview and to ask any of your questions. To those of you joining us in through public television, our great partners, Olelo, are broadcasting this currently on Channel 49. We'll be able to rebroadcast this to all of those who might have missed it, and we will re-show this as well. So without further ado, we'd like to invite Director Louis Salaveria to the center.
Thank you, Representative. It is a pleasure of mine to be able to talk about. Are you guys okay if I sit down? Okay. To talk a little bit about the budget and maybe in some ways dispel some of the myths around what it is actually the budget is all about. The state of Hawaii is a living organism. It is an entity that requires money to operate. And I know you've heard, how much does it cost? The first question is, how much does it cost to actually run state government? The budget is in many ways a representation of the priorities of the people of the state of Hawaii. And when I say, okay, well, the budget for the state of Hawaii is $20 billion. Well, what does $20 billion really mean? Okay, so we know that the budget is a combination of many different sources of funding. The biggest source of funding, which you'll hear about a lot, is what we call the general fund. The general fund is essentially the taxes and fees that are collected by the state of Hawaii that we use and we collect ourselves. We have other types of funds within the state. We have federal funds. Federal funds make up a big chunk of the state's operating budget. And then we have non-general funds. And non-general funds are, in many ways, fees that different departments collect that they use in order to cover their own operations. So when you think of $20 billion, $20 billion is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. But that's not actually what it takes to run government, right? Yes, $10 billion goes in, goes out. We maintain that. In many ways, if you look at the overall financial plan, and the financial plan and the budget in brief. And I would direct everybody to go to the Department of Budget and Finance's website. On the Department of Budget and Finance's website, you will see a multitude of different documents. The first document that I would point everybody to is what we call the budget in brief. The budget in brief gives you an overview of all of the revenues that the state of Hawaii collects, all of the departments that are essentially funded by the state, as well as the different priorities and the different asks that are in there. So if you take a look at that, you'll get a much more detailed breakdown. But what I've, at least in my experience, and I've been doing this, like what Representative Belatti says, for a very long time, in both the public and private capacity too as well. Budgeting is a planning document, right? It is essentially a plan, and what you want to do is you want to work towards your plan. Your plan has expected outcomes that you want to achieve. If you're in the private sector, you're looking at, what is your return on investment for every dollar that you come in. The same can be said for government, but investment from government's perspective can take a very different connotation, right? Investment in public health, public safety, public education. All of these different things are not necessarily what you would consider, kind of your cookie cutter type of ROI, return on investment. But I think anybody that looks at an operating budget, looks at a financial plan, will basically kind of get a overall picture of what the priorities are, of what you want to accomplish with the money that you're using and the money that you're spending on. So, Governor Green's administration, from the very beginning, and when I first started, he had made a commitment to making Hawaii a more affordable place to live. There was a lot of conversation around how to get that done. And if you can listen to some of the things that the governor and what this administration talks about, what is the one single biggest thing? What is the one single biggest part of an individual's income that they spend on in our state? It's housing and shelter. So what can we do as government in order to bring down the cost of housing? When residents of the state of Hawaii spend a disproportionate share of their income on housing in comparison to people in other states, then you realize that that's a significant portion of the cost of living in the state of Hawaii. So housing has always been a number one priority of the governor, and making sure that we can, one, build the capacity, because if you look at some of the statistics, and actually this is kind of going back to my DBED days, so we are at the lowest rate of new housing startup in the state of Hawaii now than we've been since World War II. Think about that. Our new housing startup is at its lowest point right now. We haven't had this low new housing startup since World War II. So we know that, one, Hawaii is a desirable place to live. I have been very fortunate to be able to grow up here, grow up in the pineapple fields of Mililani. There are no pineapple fields in Mililani anymore, unfortunately. But I've been fortunate. I was very lucky. I was able to stay here. I found a good job. Was able to, basically not have to move away, like a lot of my friends did. And one of the reasons why a lot of my friends did have to do that was because of the cost of housing. And so, housing, huge component of the governor. And the governor he'll bop me on the side of the head if he doesn't say one of the other things that the governor is really, really, he's passionate about, because he is Dr. Governor Green, is the health care, is the health of the people of Hawaii. Housing, health care, cost of living, educational equity, as well as the environment. These are major pillars of the Green administration and what we continue to push forward. And as you can see, and if you look at the budget, and the budget is essentially a compilation of priorities of this administration, the budget will reflect those priorities throughout every single piece of every department, whether it's the money that we're putting in the Department of Land and Natural Resources for watershed protection, for what we're doing in the Department of Health for for mental health access, what we're doing in the Department of Business and Economic Development to put in significant amount of resources to continue to build affordable housing in the state of Hawaii. These are all of the priorities that make up what, in this particular case, is Governor Green's first full biennium budget. Because when we came in 2 years ago, we were working off of a budget that was essentially prepared by the previous administration, because obviously we came in December 10 or December 6. Budget was due at the legislature December 16th. We don't have 10 days to prepare a budget, so the budget is essentially prepared by the previous administration. This is the first full biennium budget of the Green administration, and as you can see, significant amount of investment has been made in all of the different priorities that the governor has in front of him. I want to dispel some of the myths around budgeting. And so I think, everybody looks at the budget, this $20 billion document that somehow it compiles, payroll for 30,000 government employees, operating expenses for 19 different departments, everything from Medicaid payments to to a new truck in the Department of Agriculture. Every year, and we have to prepare a budget, and it is an incremental budget, because there are many different ways, and I've been doing budgeting for a very long time. There are many different ways to budget. I know you've heard it before: zero-based budget, incremental budget, activity-based budget, program planning, and budget management. There's all of these different ways of doing a budget. The state of Hawaii, or any large organization, we have limitations too as well. Some of the limitations that we have is time. Some of the limitations that we have are the resources that we have, as well as the tools that we use. So, putting together a $20 billion budget is not, it's not an easy task. And it requires a lot of reiterative process. So to walk you through how it kind of works, usually starting around August, September, what we do is we send out budget instructions to all of the departments. And we say, okay, take a look at what you had in the previous year, make all of the different adjustments with regards to what you were given in the previous year, and start that off as your base. And what we do is that using your base, we make these adjustments. Some costs are recurring. Like, say, for example, we gave you, and I'm just going to pull off the top of my head, $500,000 to buy new equipment. Well, you don't need you bought the new equipment that 1 year, you don't need it the next year. So we adjust that and we pull that out, and then you start off with a new base. We develop a base, and that base usually goes out sometime in late September, early October, and we tell departments to incrementally put in a request for it. Debbie, how much request did we have this year? So there was an exorbitant amount. And by the way, Deputy Director for Budget and Finance, Sabrina Nasir, is here too as well with me. There's a finite amount of money that we have. And it is the job of the Department of Budget and Finance to collect all of the different requests. And we know what kind of bogey we have in terms of how much resources that we have. And I'm going to say when we put together the budget, we probably had a bogey of around, between 4 to 500 million. I think we got in the magnitude of about $1.2, $1.3 billion worth of requests. It's a hard process. It's a reiterative process. Not everybody is happy, and I'm going to dispel one of the truths. So one of the truths that when it comes to budgeting is that if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. When departments come in and they make a request, it's obviously their priority, right? But in the end, it's the governor's budget, it's his administration, he has his priorities. We can't fund everything. It's unreasonable to fund everything. It would be too taxing on the people of the state of Hawaii to fund everything. So what we need to do is we need to make sure and we need to adhere to the governor's priorities and make sure that we address some of those major outstanding things, the need to haves. And so when I break down the budget, when I talk about the $10 billion, which is general funds, and I'm just going to keep this to general funds right now because federal funds are essentially mandated costs that come in from the feds. Non-general funds and special funds are normally fees that are used to pay for things like the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs collects fees for people who register for professional and vocational licensing. The PVL does not request for general funds. They essentially use the fees that they collect in order to fund their operations, to pay their payroll, to pay for their operations. They do that. So what they collect in, they use to basically run their operations. The general fund is essentially what pays for all of those different areas that don't necessarily are not things that we charge for from a fee perspective. These are things that the general fund is essentially the general excise tax, TAT, income tax, and other minor taxes that the state imposes on the people of the state of Hawaii as well as visitors. So when you look at the $10 billion that the state collects in general funds, and the general fund forecast is not done by anyone within government. The general fund forecast is done by an independent body called the Council on Revenues. The Council on Revenues is made up of experts in particular fields, and what their job is to do is to essentially make a projection on what they think the next year's general fund collections are going to be. And that, by constitution, we must adhere to when it comes to preparing the budget. And the Council on Revenues meets 4 times a year. The last meeting that they had, which is in September, is the forecast that what we use to prepare the governor's budget. The Council on Revenues will meet tomorrow to do a new forecast. And that's what the legislature will use in terms of preparing their budget. So, as you can see, Council on Revenues they may have been here in September, they may go down here in January, they may go up here in January. So everybody's going to kind of have a different perspective when it comes to approaching the budget, and both representatives here will kind of understand when you go through the legislative process, they take a look at the governor's budget, they see what the Council on Revenues has done. Hopefully, I would say the best thing that could happen for the budget for the process is that the Council on Revenues stays the same, so both the administration and the legislature are looking at the same set of numbers. But if those numbers change, then it becomes the legislature's authority to make those changes. So, the $10 billion budget, the budget that we're essentially working off of in the state of Hawaii, when you look at the breakdown of that $10 billion, that $10 billion, half of that goes for things that are called fixed costs, things that we have no control over. The biggest portion of that is essentially the state's debt. And the state has 3 major forms of debt. We have the debt that we pay on our bonds that we issue every year, and this is the money that we use to pay for government infrastructure. So the government, the state of Hawaii, is a consistent borrower in the bond market because essentially to pay for that road, that infrastructure, because we know that has a life of more than 1 year, you don't want to collect all of that money from everybody in 1 year and then pay for it. So what you'll do is you'll borrow that money and then you'll essentially pay it down over the life of that bond, over the life of that asset. So that's why government is a consistent borrower in the bond market, And that's how we fund government operations, so that we're not overtly burdening the residents of the state of Hawaii when it comes to large expenses, because assets have life that beyond just one particular year. So, of that $10 billion, debt service, premiums on employee health care, retirement benefits, health care, as well as pension benefits, make up a significant portion of what we call non-fixed cost. And the other one is what we use to cover Medicaid payments for the state of Hawaii. So these are fixed costs. These are non-negotiable. These are non-negotiable costs where we know we fund them no matter what. The rest of it, the $5 billion, essentially is what goes to help run government operations for the 19 different departments within the state of Hawaii. So, as you can see, the pie, you start off at $20 billion, the pie kind of gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you realize, okay, how much do you really have in order to run government? And so, kind of dispelling some of the myths around, okay, it's $20 billion. What does $20 billion mean? Well, when you get down to the brass tacks of it all, it really comes down to how much variability or how much non-fixed costs does the state have in order to make those type of priority type of expenditures that we do on a year-by-year basis. Those being public education, affordable housing infusions, you name it, economic development. All of these different components have a very proportional share, a smaller proportional share of that overall pie when we look at the state's operating budget. So, hard truth number one, if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So, it's imperative upon budgeters, whether it's the legislature, whether it's the administration, or whether it's people, to kind of understand priorities are going to be, there's no more a priority than your own priority. That's kind of the truth that we deal with over here. And so, I think from a budgeting particular standpoint, the hard job for the administration as well as for the legislature is how do you make sure that you can, appropriately manage and address the needs of our constituents, but at the same time still making government operate when, if I had an unlimited supply of money, yeah, I would fund this 100%, but maybe I can't fund it at 100%. Maybe it takes a little bit longer to do it. Maybe I need to come up with a much more methodical plan and a step basis of getting there, because I also have to pay for salaries for people who teach our kids, for example, or just the office clerk in, the Department of Human Resources. So there's a multitude of expenses that the state of Hawaii gets, and the hard truth is that everything is a priority, but the one main thing, and I think and I am not an elected official. I've never had the courage to put my name on a ballot, but for any elected official is really kind of managing the expectations on what can or cannot be delivered at any given point in time. But it's not without a lack of trying. There's always a matter of resources, and part of that is just understanding where and how we collect those resources going forward.
Director.
Yes.
I feel like you're trying to call us up, so we want to come in and swoop in. Can we do that?
Please, by all means. So, dialogue, and between the three of us and all of you here, I'm a firm believer of death by PowerPoint, so I don't have a PowerPoint. Except when I go to the legislature.
I'm actually PowerPointed overwhelmed because it is the start of budget briefings now.
Yes,
and
it is.
So we are pouring over all kinds of presentations. What I want to do to start this portion of it, and it's really, first of all, Louis, you are an explainer in chief.
Oh, really?
Not just the budget chief. You're an explainer-in-chief. You just simplified a lot of a process that I think most of the public don't understand about how difficult this is. And I think, thank you for reminding us that this is the governor's first biennial budget. I mean, this is a big deal for him, and I think in many ways he's, putting forward his priorities, and we're seeing what he's really sticking to housing and healthcare and all of that. As we engage in this dialogue, I want to invite the folks who are here in the room. There are cards at your table. Please, if you have questions for our explainer-in-chief, if you want him to simplify something that just doesn't make sense, now's the time to ask. We have staff members out who will be collecting the cards and bringing them up to us, but we do want to invite you to ask your questions. Rep. Perruso, do you want to ask your first questions?
Please.
To move this along?
I do, and thank you so much. Again, the sign of a true public servant is the willingness to come out in public after a long work day and engage in, not necessarily predictable conversations. So I really appreciate that. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what you haven't talked about, so the shadow of what you talked about. So you talked about budgeting as the generative process that for you began around August and September, and you mentioned that it's an incremental approach, but you've really focused on the spending. And I'm curious about the role that your office plays in conversations with the administration around revenue generation, because this group, and I think the group that has been engaged in this budget conversation over the course of these 6 months has been really looking at this question of tax fairness and revenue generation. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. No, and thank you for reminding me, because I know I talked a lot about the budget, because one of the things that's important, and I've said this, it is the Department of Budget and Finance. So there's an and in there, and the finance part. It really is my primary focus and job is the financial plan of the state of Hawaii. So that's balancing both expenditures and revenues that are coming in. So the issue of tax fairness and what the governor has done, and what the legislature has done for that matter. If you look at the course of the financial plan over the last several years, and depending on which administration comes in, what I personally look at is what I call the carryover balance. And the carryover balance is essentially how much you have left over when you have revenue over expenses. And as you can see over the course, when I came in 2011, and we had just come out of the previous administration, and I'm sure some people here remember the 2000s furlough Fridays. There was a significant kind of contraction in government revenues at that point in time. The carryover balance for the state of Hawaii was negative $220 million. We came in 2011, and we had to make significant reductions to overall government spending. We had to ask for. We had to look at like revenue generation too as well, where we could generate revenue in order to cover the hole at that point in time. And through a combination of different things that we did, we and gosh, that's 14 years ago. So over a decade ago. I think one part is that you never want to overburden people. And one of the things, and we've had this discussion within the administration and with the legislature, is the general excise tax. One of the things about the general excise tax is because it is, in many ways, and rating agencies are agencies that view the state's credit. And what they do is they give us a credit rating that determines, AA, junk, whatever, AAA, and everything. And that is essentially, that becomes when you go to a bank and you say, well, I got a good credit rating, you get better interest rates. So we try to maintain that. So the general excise tax is a tax that is the envy of many other states because it is so broad-based. It is not a sales tax on an item that is purchased at the end. It is a tax on a transaction. So it taxes both sales as well as services. And that's why it is the envy, and it's one of the reasons why the state has a very good bond rating, is because of the general excise tax. And one of the things, too, is that the general excise tax is also an exportable tax. Tourists that come to the state of Hawaii pay the general excise tax. In, studies from the Department of Taxation, DOTAX, say as much as 1/3 of the general excise tax actually is covered by non-residents, by people outside of the state of Hawaii. So I know that there are, and if you look at the trajectory of the general excise tax, and not just the general excise tax that gets exported out, because we are not a manufacturing state. We don't manufacture things, so our economy is constrained in terms of what we can or cannot accomplish. So our biggest export is essentially the general excise tax, which is tourism. That's our biggest export. And so from that particular perspective, keeping the general excise tax, and it helps kind of ameliorate the impact that we had. And it's one of the reasons why I believe the legislature and even the governor in Green Affordability Plan 1 and Green Affordability Plan 2 wanted to take a look at lowering the income tax rate for the state for the people of the state of Hawaii. We started off in the first year of the administration with the Green Affordability Plan 1. We increased the earned income tax credit. We tried to make some particular changes to the income tax brackets. We got we got some tax credits, child independent care tax credit increased too as well. But then when we moved into Green Affordability Plan 2, we wanted to kind of expand upon that, knowing that the more we can generate, or the more that we continue to generate revenue on that side, we can lower income taxes. And so if you look at what happened, and the governor's been on the news talking about this a lot, we are going from the second highest income tax state in the nation to the fourth lowest in the nation by the time the income tax reform is fully implemented in 2030. So it's a step-by-step, it's a yearly incremental increases in income tax relief for the people of the state of Hawaii, starting in 2024, which was an increase in the standard deduction for everybody. And for standard deduction, which is great when you talk about tax equity, when you think about it, who are the people that really take standard deductions? Mostly are renters, people that don't have a lot of itemized deductions, non-property owners. So increasing the standard deduction really helps those individuals that are all of a sudden going to get this increase in or lower tax rate that they're going to get, and that's going to be straight money back to the people.
Can I push back a little bit on this?
Sure.
Because look, I've been around the legislature now for 18 years, and I agree that the general excise tax is the envy of many other states. And I agree and recognize that through the general excise tax that's paid by everybody, including tourists, we have a large chunk of money that comes into our revenues that helps our state. One of my concerns, though, is, and we've heard this as well, the general excise tax is also a very regressive tax. Because it's so broadly based, it's on all things food, some medicines, there's some medicines that are exempted, but medicines, medication service, medical services, right? That part of the budget that relies on general excise taxes does rely heavily upon residents and can escalate the cost of living. Now, one of the things, and I'm right there with you, HB 2404, which is the largest tax cut for the state of Hawaii, is something that we needed to do. But there are some of us out there who think maybe it went a little bit too far, because as we go out into the out years and we look at the income tax cut breaks that the wealthiest in our community are receiving in comparison to the lowest ends, there's a concern that we're going to not have the revenues that we need to pay for the fixed costs that you talked about earlier on a going forward basis. And I think the conversation that's been had amongst the concept revenues, I love it when they use these fancy words that I don't understand. They're like, it's dynamic pricing. We have to watch and look at this dynamic revenue structure now. Because what we did with HB 2404 was, with those historic tax cuts, what was once a progressive income tax structure that provided some relief, perhaps, to lower income families, we have now shifted a potential greater burden onto the other tax revenues that we collect, i.e. GET and TAT. So amongst some of us, the way this gets framed at the federal level is the Trump tax cuts for the wealthiest. In many ways, if those get continued, which we expect they will under the new Trump administration, right? I think the question then becomes, if we're going to start seeing cuts from the federal government, and that's a very real fear, correct? I mean, one of the things that's causing the uncertainty, when I hear Carl Bonham talk about the uncertainty, what is he talking about? Potential wars, potential conflict, tourism not rebounding, tariffs that might come down from the Trump administration, cuts to the Medicaid funding, restructuring of large programs, right? So given all of that, how do we analyze and understand some of the tax proposals that are coming in, and maybe do we need to relook at what HB 2404 did in the out years, or does the legislature and governor himself is also going to be proposing some tax increases, right? The tourist tax that he's going to be increasing. That is another way to export, right? And I think that is a tax that doesn't burden our residents. So now that we've kind of reshaped the way in which we get our revenues, right? I'm actually more partial to now proposals that I once wasn't. For example, should we provide some kind of GE relief for food? I mean, that, when you talk to our constituents, the high cost of eggs and milk, and then you top onto that the general excise tax, is there a way, since we've done a historic change now to our income, our once progressive income tax structure, should we now be looking at other revenues to make sure we provide relief to the residents who need it the most?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm gonna preface it with I'm not a tax person, and so I think one of the safeguards of 2404 is that it did make incremental changes, so that there is an ability to actually go and take a look at it. And one of the things that we saw, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Council on Revenues now, because that's an important aspect when we look at the income tax reform that was passed. In September of 2023, the Council on Revenues forecasted, they made their forecast. And and in September of 2023, this was right after Lahaina going into the legislative session. All of these different things. It was to say that it was chaotic wouldn't even begin to describe how everything was being approached. But the Council on Revenues made their projection in September of 2023 based upon X amount of revenue. And over the course of it, and they met 3 other times. They met in January, they met in May, and then they met in June, and then in September. They met in January, April, September, and March. March. March, May, and September. And in September, in this last one, the one that we did, in spite of all of the changes, and this is something that was a surprise to me when they looked at it, because when we had looked at the Council on Revenues projection in May, our concern was that, there's going to be a significant, change in our revenue picture going forward. But the Council on Revenues went in and they looked at it and they said, well, there are a couple of other things that were happening in the economy. Construction, and I know Dr. Bonham talked a lot about what is happening with construction right now. Construction is going gangbusters. And so they think that that's going to prop up the economy for at least the next 2 years. And what that does provide for us is it provides a level of at least the first 2 years of the income tax reform to basically see if those projections hold. Because if those projections hold, then essentially, and tax people will always say, tax breaks don't pay for themselves. That is a complete fallacy when say, I'm going to give somebody, $1 back and then it's going to come back to me $1.20. No, that doesn't happen. You give somebody $1, maybe you get 17 cents back. That's the dynamic pricing, by the way, where that the tax people like to use. But if you look at that trajectory and what it's going forward, is that what I think the legislature, and I do this as the body, when the body looked at and the legislature looked at it, they saw what was essentially that growing carryover balance year after year. And when you see that growing carryover balance year after year, government is not in the business of holding money. That's not our job. We need to spend money. We need to invest it back into the people. So when you see carryover balance start to grow, and it grew to a significant portion during the Ige administration, it got I said when I first started in 2011, the carryover balance was negative 220. By the time we left in 2014, it got up to $200 million. Yay!
Okay, I'm going to interject because this is a question from the community out here. So how much carryover surplus do we have now under Governor Josh Green?
We have this most recent budget that we proposed. After everything that we did, the carryover balance will be $1 billion. So, but this is before the legislature comes in. Okay, and so the way the financial plan works is you do not go and say take it. So I talk about what I call a structurally balanced financial plan, and where we are in terms of a structurally balanced financial plan is 15% reserves, so that we have it. It's essentially our emergency budget and reserve fund. So 15% of $10 billion is $1.5 billion. I'm happy to say we are at that amount.
And we want to keep that amount.
We want to keep that amount
as we go through the legislative session. And so it's going to be in the priorities.
Correct.
That if we change something, then we have that conversation.
So you have, but then you have $1.5 billion in the emergency budget and reserve fund. You have, $1 billion in your carryover balance. Carryover balance is not your reserve fund. So I always said a structurally sound financial plan is 15% hard reserves and 5% carryover balance. So a 5% carryover balance is about $500 million.
So $1.5 billion in our emergency
budget and reserve fund,
and $500 million should be what we carry over
in the carryover. That's where you want to get to. So we're at $1 billion right now carryover balance. That does not mean you spend $500 million, because you don't go from 1 billion to 500, because the way it works, your carryover balance is what you carry over into your beginning balance in the next year. So you can't say all of a sudden you go to carryover balance $500 million in year one, and then the next year you look and you prepared a budget, and now all of a sudden, you're below. So you kind of gradually got to work your way to the $500 million carryover balance. You don't just kind of jump to it.
So, and what you mean by carryover, is really what the governor was referring to when he used the term surplus, right? And so this is what was picked up by the media, and so I think there was some confusion about that. But My question is, and I know we have more community questions, and I just, it seems to me, and coming from a community that has a number of pressing needs, and I would say statewide, we have very visible needs that require public investment. And it seems to me, though, when I look at your projections and I looked at the budget in brief, that you're really planning to decrease the amount of spending over time, is what I read. If increasing over only ever so slightly, and I am just curious as to whether or not that is a principle or a value that you want. Is it your position that government should not grow to meet the needs of the society, that it should be minimized?
So it's a good question. And so if you look at the budget brief, if you look at the financial plan, and to me, I don't see us as decreasing government or decreasing spending. And there's a couple of things that are not in the financial plan that we know are going to go in the financial plan, one of which is collective bargaining. So when you start adding in collective bargaining into, and this is public sector employee pay raises, as they go in, when you start adding collective bargaining, and the reason we don't put it in there is, we're bargaining. So it hasn't happened yet. But we know that that number is going to go in there. And so when that number is actually going in there, that number already, in my mind, is already down. It's only in there from the standpoint of showing where we are before anything is officially kind of like, checked off. Whether it's the legislative session that, in all likelihood, may come in and make changes. They may make changes to the governor's budget. They may add. They may decrease. That's the legislature's prerogative. But then there's also going to be collective bargaining. To me, I think if you can maintain that $500 million or that 5% carryover balance, because revenues are going to grow, and that's the projection, is that the growth of revenues is what we use to make the investments into the state, but kind of maintaining it. Understanding, and the reason why I say the 5% carryover is because the Council on Revenues is a projection, and a projection is a projection is a projection. Any projection beyond 2 years is what I call a swag or a scientific wild-ass guess, essentially, right? So again, we need to be a little bit cognizant, a little bit, conservative is not the right word, but to exhibit some degree of fiscal constraint, but still know that we need to make those investments in the communities, into the needs and everything. But then it goes back to that thing. What are the priorities?
Okay, I want to, there was a question here about how much of the budget is for fixed expenses. And what I heard you earlier say is that basically out of the $10 billion budget.
About $5 billion.
$5 billion is
billion.
fixed.
Yeah.
And that $5 billion fixed expenses is, again, you said debt service.
Yeah. So interest rate and principal on bonds is $1 billion, right? ERS payments is about $1 billion. Healthcare benefits is about $1 billion, and entitlements, Medicaid is about $2 billion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's shift it a little different. Is the CIP budget part of the $10 billion operating budget, or is it something separate? And the question specifically is, why is CIP a separate process where legislators put forth their top choices?
That's a good technical question, whoever asked that one. So the CIP budget is a separate budget, but what the CIP budget is in the operating budget is the debt service on CIP. So it's that $1 billion fixed cost that I talked about. So again, this is borrowing money. So we are borrowing money that we have to pay back. And so given the amount of outstanding bonds that we have to pay about $1 billion every year to service that debt. And we go out and we issue bonds on an annual basis. We just came back, Deputy and myself just came back from New York, where we sold $750 million worth of state bonds at an interest rate of about 4.9%, which is actually not bad, actually. Pat myself on the back. But, you know, that is because, you know, $750 million is, and our operating budget, we have approximately $8 billion of outstanding debt that's already been issued that we pay principal and interest on every year. We have about $5 billion of unissued debt. So this is like capital projects that the legislature has approved, but we have not issued the debt for them yet. Because what we do from budget and finance, because we manage the treasury, is we don't issue bonds and we don't borrow money on a project until it actually spends money, because you don't want to borrow money, project doesn't get off the ground just yet, and then you just sit on that money and you pay interest on something that you haven't collected yet. So the way we borrow is we borrow based upon our expenditure, not based upon what's budgeted in the CIP budget. So yes, CIP is separate, but what's included in the operating, what's included in the $10 billion general fund budget is the debt service on that CIP budget.
Quick clarifying question. So just so the community understands, so a lot of times legislators make announcements like on their social media or in their newsletters that monies for a particular project in their district have been released. So that means that the money has been borrowed or the money has been expended, the contract has been entered into to produce that project. So prior to that, so even if that CIP is approved, it's appropriated by the legislature, it does not mean that that project is going to happen, correct? So then it's ultimately the governor's decision about whether or not he will expend those monies and use that debt process to fund it.
And to be honest, there are projects that get released that lapse.
Correct.
So that's why we do not borrow based upon what's budgeted. We borrow based upon how we spend. So what we do is we have this pool of money we call the bond pool. And the bond pool is essentially what the Treasury, funds through bond issuances each year to maintain the expenditure pattern of all of the CIP projects that are going on in the state of Hawaii. And on average, we spend anywhere, it ebbs and flows, but we spend anywhere about $40 to $50 million a month on capital improvement projects.
You're looking at me. These are really, some of these are really
These
good
are really
questions.
technical. Oh, this is like,
But they're also very technical, so
Yes.
I hope I'm not missing them. But before we leave the CIP, so because Representative Perruso mentioned it, really, for those of us who are in the audience, when you see something get appropriated, for the person who's interested in it, what should they do to make sure it actually gets expended? And then, because it leaves the question, right? Last year we were faced with all of these projects in the DOE that were lapsing. They were at some point somebody's priority, but has now fallen off and maybe will never be done. So how do you encourage the public to make sure that what we appropriate as legislators actually gets expended and results in the things that we thought we wanted for the community?
ooh, okay. So let's move to so there's budget prep, there's budget development, and now we have the next part of the budgeting job is budget execution. That's the next part. So my suggestion would be, one, somebody put that request in. Somebody asked for it. It could have been a legislator. It could have been the DOE. It could have been a principal. It could have been somebody. Somebody asked for that. It didn't just materialize out of nowhere. So whoever put that request in is to find the advocate for it, whether it's the principal, whether it's Representative Perruso. I get calls from representatives all the time. It's like, hey, what happened to that one project that was in so and so? And I was like, so I always say, My job is to budget, not to expend. That usually happens at the departmental level. And so what I do is I get on somebody's case at the departmental level. Hey, by the way, where is that project and stuff like that? And so that's usually how the process kind of works out. But the thing is, just because something gets appropriated doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get expended. You have to see it through to when it gets expended. And to do that, you just need to keep on and make sure that you're working with the person who put that budget request in.
I'm going to ping it over to Representative Perruso.
On this topic, because I find it to be fascinating and frustrating. So then, given the morass of lapsing of CIP projects with the DOE, then I'm wondering what kind of role does the administration play in checking the continuation of CIP projects to that department until they have, true-upped, or I don't know, like if they, however they are going to reorganize themselves. But is that a conversation that is happening? Because I feel like my perception is that the legislators, have played a role as well, and we may have politicized the process. We may be using CIP to show our community that we care about them, right? And that we're working for them. When sometimes the DOE also has its own priorities that are separate and apart from the legislators' priorities. So I'm just wondering if there's a way that the administration is thinking about that would either like address my perception, which is a politicization problem, or some people think that it's an organizational problem within the DOE, maybe a leadership problem or an execution problem or maybe a resource problem. They don't have adequate resources to execute. What's happening in that space?
So, again, it's a great question because it leads into, departments are resourced in a particular way. They can only do what they can, what their bandwidth has, right? We don't have. I hear it often. We don't have enough staff. There's a natural level of expenditures that you can expect to come out of it, and I think anybody that's in the appropriation business, whether it's the governor, whether it's the legislature, oftentimes it's like going to the buffet, right? Oh, you see a whole bunch of stuff out over there. You're gonna pile up that plate and the buffet. Might not eat all of it, but hey, I was at the buffet. So I think that the conversation around what is that natural level of expenditure that can actually be handled, and then given the resources that we have. So, one, either you maintain your appropriation level to what they can handle, or you give them the resources so that they can increase their bandwidth. And I think that's the conversation that needs to happen. And CIP is one of those really harder ones because oftentimes, unlike the general fund, which has a one-year lapsing provision, CIP has a biennium +1. So if you get funded in this year, you have essentially 3 years to get that project done. So a lot of it is a fire and forget kind of situation. So it's one of the reasons why I think if you're very interested in a CIP project that gets appropriated, is to follow that along the line and remember that there is a shelf life for that appropriation.
Okay, I want to shift to another kind of area, not just budget, but appropriation bills or bills with appropriations. So how does finance, Ways and Means, and I'm going to add budget and finance, know if the state can afford a bill or policy if there isn't a cost estimate attached to the bill? Does finance or WAM or budget and finance have information that maybe the public doesn't have, and that they're chewing on to understand whether or not they can afford a bill or not?
So the budget is, in many ways, and I don't mean for this, the budget's easy because it's math at the very beginning, right? And then it's going to go up and down. Appropriation bills, that has a dynamic life to use your wonderful word, word
That's
dynamic.
not my word. That's the economist's word.
It has a dynamic life of itself. And we don't know. But what we do know is that given where we want to end up in the financial plan, how much money is available for appropriation bills. So that's why the financial plan is very important. Because what the financial plan takes is it takes the budget and it takes all of the appropriation bills. And we're kind of tracking that throughout the legislative session, because you may have a budget that, you're right, if we were to let's just say, pigs started flying, hell froze over, the legislature agreed to the governor's budget 100%, no changes.
That is amazing.
That means there would be 500, that you could have, there's $1 billion in the carryover balance. Granted, you don't want to go, so let's say if you wanted to gradually, maybe you could fit $200 million worth of appropriation bills in that, in order to meet the financial plan going forward.
And to have a carryover surplus of just $500 million.
Yeah, or to get to a carryover balance.
Okay.
Like, the thing is, you don't want to get there right away. You want to gradually get into the 500.
So there is a conversation happening around this thing called fiscal notes, because I think that's what that question is getting at. How do lawmakers, how do budget analysts know what a bill is going to cost? And in some states, they have things, they require fiscal notes with bills.
Yeah.
Internally to budget and finance, the governor is going to put forward some appropriation bills. And you guys have already done the analysis of that. So internally, you folks are projecting what that's going to cost, and that essentially is a fiscal note. Would you say that that's correct?
Yes. Yeah. It's essentially, yeah. It's the planning variables that we are including in the financial plan. Granted, we work with, if it's, say for example, it's a tax bill, we work with the Department of Taxation, and they're the ones that kind of come up with that estimate. If it's an appropriation bill, like let's say a straight appropriation, $500,000 to biosecurity in the Department of Agriculture, a little bit easier. It's a number. The hard one is our revenue bills that impact revenue. Let's say, for example, a tax break, or a tax, let's say, for example, a new tax. You never know. You can have an estimate what a new tax is going to make, but you're never going to know until it actually happens. It's the same thing like the historic tax break cuts. We're not going to know what the real impact is until we actually start seeing the numbers, which is, and like I said, happening right now. Because the income tax brackets are going to change in calendar 25, what DOE tax does, so every paycheck that a person receives, there's a withholding on it, right? And that withholding is your state income tax. DOE tax is changing the withholding tables of every single paycheck, public, private, every single paycheck issued in the state of Hawaii. So we know previously, in December, that tax rate was a little bit different. It was a little bit higher. Now it's a little bit lower. So now we know that the withholding is going to go down. And until we get like the real accurate numbers on what it is, it's still a projection. And I think the projection that we had was in this current fiscal year, it was going to cost around $240 million, and it was going to cost $500 million in the next fiscal year. And I think by the time it's fully implemented, the total tax reform package was going to cost about $7 billion.
Okay, this is the perfect time for this question from the audience. Okay, so the tax plan makes sense if all things go perfectly, right? But with the state likely having to take more fiscal responsibilities with the incoming federal administration, how is this tax plan that's now based off of HB 2404 being proactive to concerns that are part of our current reality if we're anticipating cuts from the federal government?
So a lot of ifs.
Yes.
A lot of ifs and everything. And yes, I think in terms of what's going to happen, and this is pure opinion. That's what that. So we know and we expect as a state that the incoming administration as well as the incoming Congress are going to extend the tax cuts. There's going to be a need to pay for those tax cuts to continue extending because there was a drop dead date. So when that drop dead date, Janet Yellen was projecting, okay, this money now comes back because those tax breaks expire. We're going to extend it. In order to extend it, they gonna need to find a way to pay for it. But the big difference between the federal government and the state government is that they can print money, and that's the whole discussion on the debt ceiling. So that's why when they say, with this increase the debt ceiling, well, that's so that the federal government can print more money so that it can spend more money. So we expect that because the federal government is going to do that, if they don't get an increase in the debt ceiling, they have to make cuts. Where are they going to make the cuts from? Whether you believe the inventor of the Tesla cars, Doge policies around making government, and I'm going to go off on a little bit of tangent. We've heard this before. Al Gore, reinventing government back in the 2000s, talked about reinventing government and making government more efficient and what was it? More efficient, less costly, faster delivery. That was like his policy back then. It's kind of the same thing. So what are they going to do? We do expect that there's going to be an impact to us. We don't know how much it is going to be. I lived through the first Trump era. I was the director of DBED at the time. And, there was some consternation during that period of time, but we survived it. And actually, in many ways, we kind of held true. We don't know until we actually see something come in. But, which is the reason why we need to take a little bit of a more conservative or constraint approach and not kind of go hog wild so that if those changes happen.
So let's talk in hypotheticals, right?
Okay.
Because, it is a very uncertain world, and we don't know what's going to happen with the federal government. But say they move towards somehow scaling back Medicaid federal funding. In our state, we know and we rely heavily upon Medicaid, and we've put up our share to draw down federal funds. If we start to see even a small reduction in the federal contribution to Medicaid, that could have widespread impacts to access of care in our most rural communities. How does the governor plan to address that? And I should ask myself that question. How is the legislature going to respond to that? But what are the plans that the governor has to respond to those kinds of cuts?
So I think one of the things is, again, maintaining our fiscal constraint to some degree in order to address that. But I think one of the things, too, and if you look at the governor's, and again, his DNA, he's a doctor. He wants healthier people. What do healthier people mean? Healthier people mean people that don't utilize services more. If you don't utilize services more, premiums go down. So I think that it's a complex rubric of different things that need to change, because it's not just money. You don't just say, okay, I'm just going to supplant it. I have this conversation a lot with just government employee healthcare benefits. Other than just saying, okay, let's just continue to pay for it, what are we actually doing to create a healthier government employee so that so they don't cost that much, so that we can actually start driving premiums down? I worked in healthcare for 10 years, finance, but healthcare. And again, there's a dualistic approach to cost in this particular perspective.
I guess I'm going to push back a little bit on it.
Okay, go ahead.
And then I'm going to throw it to Rep. Perruso, because if the cuts come down fast and furious from the federal government, and it's not this slow, drawn-out process that some of us think I hope it's slow. I hope that there's a Congress and infighting amongst the Republicans where they're not going to cut things like public education or Medicaid or Social Security. But say that they're effective at cutting some portion of that. Would you then say that in the conversations that we have as the public, this $1.1 billion surplus that we have or carryover, that shouldn't we say, okay, if we know we're going to get less from the federal government to pay for these essential services, then for the time being, we're just going to have to make the Medicaid payments a priority. Make the public education payments a priority. Make X, Y, and Z a priority. How do we get that message across? And is that what we need to do?
Absolutely. I think, especially when it comes to healthcare, and in many ways, right, it's a foundational responsibility of government as public health, is maintaining the fiscal capability in order to cover those expenses. But at the same time, we also have to look at, in a economy that's working that way. I mean, are there opportunities? And one of the good things about Medicaid, and there's a lot of discussion around universal health care and all of those different things, is that the larger the risk, the larger the pool of insured, the more purchasing power whoever is buying that insurance has in terms of driving rates. So I think you need to look at it from that way too as well. Yes, we should address the issues of shortfalls in Medicaid going forward, but we should also be looking at, okay, what about our relationships with the people that are providing that medical care to us? Let's take a look at all of these different things. And I don't want to get too ideological around, especially recent events that happen, but how healthcare is delivered in our country and stuff like that. And so
I love how you're drawing us into policy discussions about even things like, there's been a long conversation. How do we get to universal health care? Well, universal health care is so hard to get to because it's federal level, Medicare, Medicaid, and state level. But is there a place for us to look at our power as purchasers of medical services through the EUTF, through Medicaid, to like you said, restructure our relationships with to get better costs for the quality of care that we're getting?
I think that those are absolute conversations that need to happen, right? And plus, I'm a firm believer that, at the same time, yes, you have the people that are providing us with the healthcare, but then we also have, as an individual, a need or a responsibility to maintain our own health as well. So, I mean, there are a lot of multitude of different ideas, but creating a healthier population, which is one of the governor's, priorities, is a money saver. And those things are important to him, and they are tried and true, economic, fiscal realities.
Amy, you have a question. I can see you.
I do, and I do think that our time is kind of winding down. So I don't know how many more community questions you have, but I
think there's a lot, but it's hard to distill it. I'm going to pass this along to him, and then we'll see if we can get some responses. But then, Amy, did you have another question?
I have so many, but I'm going to defer to the community.
Before we leave this thing about the incoming administration, I do know that there is a budget item in the governor's budget that is going to be providing more support to our attorney generals.
Yes.
Because we do expect. Can you speak to that? What that appropriation is in the governor's budget?
All I can say is that we did add an extra $10 million into the Attorney General's budget in order for her to work with, her staff and her people, just in case that there are any type of legal issues that need to be addressed with regards to the change in the incoming administration. I'm not the best person to answer that. That would be you can invite the Attorney General to come and sit here.
All right, I have a question just rolled in. And then let's just do a time check. It is now 6:30. Maybe we'll do 2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll allow you to wrap up with some closing comments, and then we'll also close so that we'll aim for another 15 minutes, so to end at around 6:45. So the next question that just came in is, I gotta wear my glasses now. This is really hard, and I'm not very good at it. I just started using reading glasses. How do you predict revenues to grow? Tourism is maxed up in some residents' minds. Where are revenues coming from?
There is a natural growth rate, and an economy is cyclical. It always is. There's ups and downs. I think the trajectory of revenue and the way we look at it you're going to have ups and downs, but my job is to look at the long view, right? It's the 6-year financial plan, not the 1-year financial plan. And so when I say revenues is going to grow, I think revenues, it may go down in 1 year. So like I said, the next 2 years, based upon the much more smart economic minds that exist, they think that the next 2 years are going to be very bullish. But they think the years after that might be a little bearish. But then when you look at the overall trajectory during that period of time, it's just this kind of steady clip. And so revenue growth at anywhere between 2 to 3% for the state of Hawaii is kind of the norm. But what we do is we have a lot of variability. We have up years and we have down years. And so I think when I look at it, where do I think revenue growth is going to happen? A big bulk of it is going to happen in these first 2 years. Then you're going to have a tapering off of it. But then when you look at the horizon of the 6-year financial plan, we're probably at a 3% growth rate.
Okay, so I think this is a follow-up question in just this one person's question. And I think we keep coming back to it because it's about this question of tax fairness and tax equity, right? So with the historic tax cut, it's going to be bullish in the first 2 years when really it's tax cuts that are being absorbed mostly by the broader lower levels, right? And then at the later ends, there's actually more tax benefits that are going to be flowing to actually higher income folks, right?
So this first end, right, the increases in the standard deductions. That's really gonna help individuals like renters, for example.
Yes, at the lower end.
At the lower end. Then the next rate or the next change is going to be a change in the income tax brackets. So anybody who's done taxes knows, what tax bracket you're in based upon what your AGI is and what your income level is. Those have corresponding changes within each particular bracket of a particular percentage. It is higher on the lower scale than it is on the higher end, but then again, a lower percentage with a larger number is the same as a higher percentage with a lower number, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at that, it's relatively kind of spread out from that perspective. So
let me ask the question that's in it, because again, it's going to the tax fairness and equity, right? How do you think that folks at the higher level ends, for example, $140,000, I'm actually going to make that higher because I don't know if $140,000 for a family that's actually middle. That's two, could be, an office, two teachers. Okay,
yeah.
So let's say someone at the higher level incomes of like $500,000, because we have those people who are making that kind of money in this state. How do we ensure that they contribute to the government expenses that we all value and cherish, like education, right? Or basic infrastructure, protection of our natural resources. How do we ensure that they contribute to those expenses, those fixed expenses, maybe?
And so, again, from the perspective of a tax, right? If you were to take 5% off of $1 million, that's $50,000, right? So let's say your tax rate, I'm just using numbers offhand. That's $50,000. If you were to take 5% off of somebody making, $100,000, that's $5,000, right? So I think in terms of like the distribution on what people are contributing is it all depends, right? And what the rates are in each one of those particular categories. You don't want to go and say, well, if you're at $1 million, your tax rate is 0.5 and it's 5,000, and then if you're at $100,000, it's 5% and you're 5,000, and then that's like a flat tax, right? That goes there. So I think when you look at the distribution of how the income tax brackets are changing, and this really goes back to the policy makers, is how do you make sure that proportionally the individuals that that are at that higher income are contributing as much as the individuals in the lower tax brackets. Yeah.
Okay. Rep. Perruso, any questions from you? All right. See, I'm listening so much. Let's do this one last question. With the increasing concerns on popularity of the military presence, and I'm going to just read this from the card, do you expect an increase in DoD revenues?
Ooh, good question. So, Hawaii, and this is something that we talk a lot about when we talk about the impact of the federal government, not just the military, but the federal government in the state of Hawaii. They are a huge contributor to it. The military, obviously, there are many different opinions on what they do, and their presence here in Hawaii. Hawaii is obviously a strategic point in the Pacific. And do we expect that there is going to be a continued investment in the state of Hawaii? So the United States Navy made a huge investment just right. The new dry dock in Pearl Harbor right now is one of the reasons why construction is kind of like at this really high level. I mean, I want to say that dry dock was a $2 billion project, just itself. I mean, that one dry dock is essentially, it's huge. So they do make a huge contribution. But when you look at the number of military personnel that are here, it's relatively flat. That hasn't necessarily grown from that perspective. But the investments in the infrastructure and upgrading their facilities, or whether it's the new hangar at Joint Base Pearl Harbor, these are major investments in the state and into the construction industry, into the state of Hawaii, which funnels back into the economy.
I think that you're basically saying that the military has high confidence levels.
I don't think you're going to see any type of like drastic change. If there's any change, it'll be more mission related change, not because of an ideological change that we're just going to throw more money into the military, or the military is going to get out of the state of Hawaii. I think right now the investments that they're making are more indicative that they continue to see Hawaii as a strategic asset to national security.
So we're at 6:40. 5 minutes for wrap-up and any closing thoughts. You left us with a lot of things to think about, Budget Director. So I could ask one last question, and then maybe you can just roll into some closing thoughts for this, and then we'll close it out between Representative Perruso and I. So you said the governor's #1 priority is housing. You've mentioned health care, other things. But so this question is asking, what is number 2, 3, 4, and 5? If you have to go down them.
Well, housing is definitely top. Housing is top. I'm trying to remember my PowerPoint slide from yesterday. It's housing, it's homelessness, it's healthcare, it's cost of living. Cost of living is probably it's included technically around. It's kind of an overarching kind of thing. Educational environment. The environment and climate change and educational equity are huge priorities of this administration.
So we're going to be looking at all of those things. Do you want to do any last takeaways?
I just want to thank representatives. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the more that individuals get involved in the budgeting process and the more transparent we are, it kind of takes the veil away around the whole kind of like, this monstrous kind of thing. In many ways, the state budget is a representation of the state's priorities, of all of our priorities. And, we are one big tent. We have many different opinions. But at the end of the day, there is a constituent that is serviced by what is in the budget. And I think we all need to kind of approach it from that perspective.
Okay, I'm going to say a couple words and then throw it to Rep. Perruso to close out for the evening. My comments are going to be on process. First of all, again, I want to thank all of you who are here, who stayed with us. to talk about budget wonky things. I never thought I would see a room full of folks, and I know that folks are joining us out there in Olelo as well, to understand more about this budget process, because at the end of the day, the budget is the #1 priority statement for the state of Hawaii. As I said in opening, Governor Green's agencies are presenting. They're briefing the legislature now. They've handed the governor's budget to the legislature. The House of Representatives has the first crack, the first take at the budget. So in front of you, you have the legislative timeline. The next big date for the budget is going to be March 12th, when we have budget crossover. Leading up to that process will be many, many, many hearings. There will be many hearings in subject matter committees, and there are going to be hearings in finance. And the finance committee is going to be putting together a budget that's going to cross over on March 12th. It will actually be decked on March 10th? I want to make sure. Yes, March 10th. And so that's when the public is going to be able to see what we've done and how we might have changed some of the priorities or worked with the governor to rework some of the priorities in light of some of the changing situations that we know are going to come. We've talked about it, the beginnings of the new administration. We're going to see effects, tax revenues coming in. We're going to see a Council of Revenue new projection sometime in February, March. That's going to change the budget. Or tomorrow is going to be a whole new budget scenario, different from what Director Salaveria was dealing with months ago. So that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of dynamic process we're in, and we want to invite all of you to be a part of that process through the hearings process, through the conversations we're going to have in committees, and then ultimately when legislators get to vote on the budget bill. It will be decked again on March 10th, which means that's when you guys can take a look at it. Now it's going to be a dense, big 300, 400, 500-page document. We will later on have budget worksheets, we hope, so that you can actually track all of these things. We will continue, I think Perruso and I are going to continue to try to do these kinds of gatherings so that we can understand and really collectively understand how it is that we are all putting together this budget that means so much to everybody in the state, clearly to the agencies who have to implement it, but also to us because it delivers the services that we so desperately need. So I want to invite you to stay engaged in the process. Visit us at capital.hawaii.gov, follow the budget bills, stay in touch with us through our offices, and we will inform you of more of these kinds of opportunities to kind of dive into the budget and understand where we're going. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, and then we'll close it out. Representative Perruso.
Thank you so much. And I just want to, again, express my gratitude to Director Salaveria because it is extraordinary. You are a true public servant because I think that these conversations are challenging not just in terms of their complexity, but also they're challenging because they ask us to really think critically about our own values and how those values kind of either mesh or are not consonant with the values of those around us. And I think that the budget is so important because it is a document that fundamentally expresses our collective values. So I think that when we started down this road talking about a people's budget, we were really interested in a kind of unearthing that conversation. What are the underlying values? What are the collective values that are expressed in the budget? And then how can we use that particular document to more clearly articulate what we see as the shared community values that may not, like I will speak as a legislator, I live in my bubble. And I think it's really important for people in positions of power to, as much as possible, have conversations with folks who might not necessarily agree with them. And I think that what I appreciate about Della so much is she's willing to have those kinds of conversations. She takes me to talk to Republicans all the time. And I think that that's how we grow and that's how we connect and reconnect to each other and produce better policy outcomes. And your willingness to participate in this conversation means a lot to me. So thank you very much.